story. Independent journalist Don Lemon and Georgia Fort say they will keep reporting after being released from federal custody following their arrests after covering an anti-immigration enforcement protest at a St. Paul, Minnesota church. A federal grand jury indicted both on civil rights-related charges. Lemon, of course, as you know, is a former CNN anchor, and Fort, a Minneapolis area reporter. Insists that they were documenting the events as journalists, not participating in the protest. Lemon's attorney called the action an unprecedented attack on the First Amendment, but has vowed to fight the charges in court. So what are your thoughts? Was Lemon reporting or protesting? Was he simply doing his job as a journalist or working to create a social media moment? What do you think? 713-440-8870. Thoughts?
Well, in the pastor part of the ICE...
That's the allegation that was made why the protest was happening.
Yeah. So they decided to protest at his church.
Yeah.
And that's a legitimate, that is a man by its dog story. I mean, that's a whole different game there, that this pastor is with ICE and now these people are showing up to protest, I guess, his membership or his allegiance to or whatever.
Well, the thing, though, keep in mind, it's that they went inside the church. That's where the big problem is.
The churches want you inside. That's all you ever hear.
Come
join our church.
Celeste, what are your thoughts?
When government attack journalists, the cost is paid by the public. At the end of the day, when governments attack journalists, the cost is paid by the public. At first glance, I thought, this is a real, attack on the First Amendment and the ability for journalists to be able to work. I will also say, on the other line, I'm not sure that going into a church is the best way to get your message across. Some would say, well, it is absolutely the best way. We're all talking about it. There's a lot of question around it. However, looking at Don Lemon, I'm thinking to myself, that felt a little performative. And I think that there are ways to have impact without, causing so much of a disruption of asking how was this handled? Was it handled? Without there's so much around it. And it just felt very performative. I do have real issue with people protesting within churches. That is a sacred space. I don't think... regardless of the pastor was a part of ICE. Let me tell you, there are a lot of pastors that stand at the pulpit that people should rush in and question what they're doing, right? However, I don't think, as a regular churchgoer, it felt to me disruptive. I did not think that was the right way. I think Don Lemon should know better. There are ways to get your message across in a much more productive way. It's unfortunate. You can seek truth.
Right.
You can seek truth and help the public understand your message without going inside a church.
I don't know exactly the temperature, but we were having another spell of 27 degrees Sunday morning. I imagine that church outside was pretty dangerously cold.
Yeah, but the weather doesn't dictate what's legal and what's not legal.
Was it illegal for the protesters to show up in the church?
And
inside the church is where the question is. They're going in to protest cross a line. Nobody is saying they didn't have, well, maybe some are, but legally nobody's saying they didn't have the right to protest outside the church.
Isn't that where the story was? The story is where the protesters were. Why are you here? What are you doing?
Right.
Well, how are you going to have that story outside the church?
Right, but the bigger question is where did Don Lemon fit into the story?
He was covering it like a journalist.
Covering it, or was he part of it? Did he?
That's the big question.
There's a video out there of him there giving coffee to the protesters and talking with them and friendlying with them and talking about what they're going to do. So the question comes, was he in the planning of it to create? And that's why I even changed our question to, was he trying to create a social media moment? Was he creating something so that he could then cover it and be there on the scene because he was working?
That's a whole different accusation.
Right. And that's the issue that I have here, is that he is crossing lines, making it difficult for all journalists. And that's my issue. A free press is a safeguard against authoritarianism. Flat out, when journalists are targeted, it's often a warning sign that the democratic norms are under threat. And so there's this kind of blanketed issue that we're seeing across right now within our democracy of questioning where journalists are doing their job, when it's becoming too much of their own platform. So we're questioning journalism and democracy in general. And then to have Don Lemon go inside a church does not do anybody any favors.
But wait a minute. It wasn't services. I mean, this protest was happening.
So
the church then sort of becomes a building, unless you want to argue that
No,
a church
there was. They were having
there was
Sunday morning service.
But then the protests take over.
They came in and disrupted the
Right. And
the
so
service.
he, as a journalist, said, "What's going on?"
Right.
So why was he and Georgia the only ones that were arrested?
They were
Why
the
weren't
high-profile
protesters?
ones.
Why weren't protesters arrested? They're the ones that were really making the story.
Right, and I'm not sure. I assume that there were protesters arrested too. These two are getting attention because they were journalists. For me, the question is, where is now once the protest begins in the church, once the action has begun in the church, for Don Lemon to have been in there to cover it, I think is fine. I think once the event has happened. For me, my question lies, how involved was he in the event happening?
Well, you'll never know the answer
Right.
to that.
And,
covering a protest inside a church, I don't know. Come on.
If somebody is shot inside of a church and it's a story and the media comes in and covers that, they're coming into the church once the event has happened. That's where I'm falling on it. I think that he has a right to cover it. I think he has a right to report on it. I think if the timeline I'm seeing is right, the disruption had happened before he started interviewing people. So if that's the case, I have less concern. I'm more concerned whether or not he was instigating.
713-440-8870. Let's go to James from the Woodlands. James, welcome to Hello Houston.
Hello and happy Monday. I have about as much information as you do about what happened, which is not complete. You know, I've tried to gather as much as I could. However, I am totally for freedom of the press, and if a protest happens in a church, which it doesn't happen all the time, this is not a frequency,
right.
That I believe that is appropriate, and if he was a journalist, he has a right to cover that. Now, why he was arrested and the other people weren't, I'm not sure. Of course, I feel like the police have a right to arrest people, but we have a right to freedom of assembly and protest against things that we have grievances against. And so this is our freedom, like it or not. I'll say one last thing. Jesus would be arrested for going into churches and turning over tables and calling people out. He did that during his ministry. So I feel it's our right as Americans to do this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. I also want to clarify, too, from my point of view, is that I also think Don Lemon has a right to be involved in protests if he wants to, but he has to know which hat he's wearing. We all have a right to protest what we don't believe in, and even if his job is as a journalist, well, then are you there as a protester with this group of people standing up against something you don't believe in, or are you there to cover it as a journalist? There are two different
That's
things.
the other problem,
to,
is that if you're a journalist and you go to a protest, you're taking a side. So you can no longer report.
Why are you taking a side?
If you're
Fill me in on
going
that.
to a protest, if you're marching in a protest for something with people,
and you have a camera and a microphone, and you're walking with them and asking them questions,
that's
doesn't
covering
make you,
it.
Well,
That's
what he was
covering it.
doing. From what I saw, that's exactly what Don Lemon was doing.
Yeah,
he had a camera and he had a little microphone, wasn't a big microphone, and he was talking to people.
And I did see where he was talking to the minister of the church.
The pastor
and
asked him to leave.
When he said to him, "I'm Don Lemon. I'm here covering it. I'm not part of the protest. I'm covering. I'm a journalist here." And he was establishing that when he did his interviews. What's Celeste?
He was going where the story was.
Yeah.
And so we have to assume he did not tell those people to go inside the church. They did that because it was cold outside and they wanted to go in the church to protest. And so he followed them in. Now, to your point, maybe he organized the whole thing. And
I don't think he organized the whole thing, but what he knew. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to read something we have that just came in. It said rap. We've gone too long in this segment.
So I'll tell you this. It's interesting YouTube comments from the whole Don Lemon thing.
Yeah, in the first hour, we were talking about Don Lemon arrest for the protest in the church in Minnesota.
Yes, we were discussing how, everything that happened in Minnesota and the Don Lemon being arrested.
And the pastor has a side job working for ICE.
Yes, and so we received a lot of YouTube comments. Jules Med said, the fact that we're questioning why a reporter is covering a news-relevant story that just happens to involve a pastor and his church pretty much sums up why we are slipping toward fascism. Another dark one, Joy says, if the protest is illegal and Lemon had prior knowledge, then he is guilty of a crime. Jules then said, we send reporters to war zones into the middle of hurricanes. Why is that churches are suddenly off limits?
That's a good point, Ernie. Why are churches off limits?
I don't know.
Nicole Joe says, I'm not very upset about protesters going into a church. ICE has gone into and arrested people from other important sacred places, which I think is way more reprehensible.
I thought that was an interesting comment. I hadn't thought about it in those terms.
And then my British computer guy says, First Amendment rights do not protect entering private property to disrupt a religious service where others are exercising their right to freedom of religion. Drops mic and exits stage right. We received a text. This is Jen in Clear Lake. Why is this about nitpicking Don Lemon rather than the ICE agents who have a history of illegal behavior? And then we received another email. If Don Lemon had been replaced by a Fox News reporter at the protest, there would have been no arrest, only praise for the journalist who daringly interrupted the Antifa protest. It is all a matter of pleasing the convicted felon in the Oval Office. And that was from Maryland.
A lot of interesting thoughts on that.
A lot of interesting thoughts on it. I continue a lot of interesting thoughts.
Is that all you're going to say on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's multiple stories at play here. And I think the issue that is at hand that we're discussing is not what the protest was about, the ICE agent, minister, whatever that connection is. It's how protests are happening in today's day and age, where they happen, how different parts of the political spectrum view it so differently, and how when things are allowed and when they aren't. And then the whole idea of the attack, quote unquote, on a journalist. You know, where are we going with our freedom of reporting, of journalism, just basically? And is this encroaching on that, or is it saying, because of where they went and how it was planned and what happened, is that also at play?
Well, and then really, we've talked about this protest going on in this church. Mm-hmm. Was this protest all about protesting the pastor being a part of ICE? What do we know about this protest?
Yeah, that the behavior of ICE in Minnesota, the people protesting.
But you don't just show up in a church and protest behavior of ICE.
Right. But when you find a hook, a connection, which is, oh my, in our community, we have a minister who is there and he is also working for ICE, that is a trigger point for a protest.
So that's the reason the protest was
at that church.
Well,
yes.
Then that kind of makes more sense that, he's the one they're protesting.
He became the symbol of something they were
protesting. So
protesting
going into
against
his church, where you can look at him in the eye and say, we disagree with what you're doing, that seems like the place to do it, as opposed to outside the church, where he stays inside and you stay outside.
Right. And when I look at this, I'm looking at this headline simply at Don Lemon is a journalist, and he decided to go with this group of people into a church. Do I think that pastors should be also ICE agents or leading ICE initiatives? That's a problem. That's problematic, right? We can dissect that within itself. What I am looking at strictly is Don Lemon as a journalist going with protesters into a church. Was he covering it? I think that even as a journalist, you can make sound decisions and give the entire story without having to be so disruptive. I'm also not thinking about anybody else than simply families that were going to church that Sunday and were just at church with their children, and protesters entered their place of worship to yell and scream and protest. Regardless of the reason, they could have every right to be yelling and screaming and everything, but I'm thinking that Sunday morning there were families with their children sitting just ready to go to church, and they were probably faced with this situation.
Well, that's the world we live in now. And
Well,
especially if you're in
that's
Minneapolis.
a really scary world.
Especially
that you
Minneapolis
can't go to church
is a very scary
without
world.
having to be interrupted by protesters.
Yeah. Well, look at what has happened in Minneapolis in the last 2 weeks.
It's horrific.
It's
However, we are really questioning the lines of just where are lines.
There aren't any.
Well, and part
There
of
aren't
what
any.
is at play here is what's called the FACE Act. And we haven't really talked about that. It's the freedom of access to clinic entrances. But it plays a part in this because, if I'll read this for you, it's a federal law prohibiting the use of force, threat of force, or physical obstruction to injure, intimidate, or interfere with anyone obtaining or providing reproductive health services or exercising religious freedom at a place of worship. Violation can result in significant fines and prison sentences. So there is a statute, the FACE Act it's called, and so that's part of what they're looking at. They're saying, okay, you don't have a right to go into these places. So that's part of it, should the protesters have been there. And the second part, as Celeste is talking about too, is the fact, where was Don Lemon's part in all of this? Now, we have often embedded journalists in groups, organizations to get an inside story for a journalistic point of view. So a reporter, for me, being in with a group of protesters to cover it is not a problem for me either. If you're embedded with a group of protesters and that protesting group goes into the church and you're there covering what's happening, you go with them as a journalistic point of view. My issue, my concern is how coordinated and thought out ahead of time was this? Was he part of the organization of it, or was he simply a journalist covering it?
And, the fact of the matter is what we do know is that there are journalists, local journalists in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, that are every single day there covering it, talking to people every single day, that you're not seeing them on national news, but they are telling the story and they are seeking truth and they are trying to provide people with information. And you can go to Minnesota Public Radio and you can go find local journalists. And to me, Don Lemon as a journalist doing that and going was very performative.
And I also want to say, though, the local journalist, Georgia Fort, was also arrested.
She's
and she is the one that is a voice of their community.
within
and does a
their
lot of
community.
stuff. Yeah.